Hi, I'm Dr. Jonathan Wisco, the handy anatomist and the founder of Better Learning Experiences. This is the next video in a series to talk about tips for applying to professional school. And this video is a little bit more specific towards medical school admissions, although as in the other videos that we've done, the principles are generalizable across disciplines. So I'd like to share my screen. And again, the question that we ask ourselves is, why do you want to go to professional school? Why do I want to go to professional school? And just as a review from the last video that we've done, I wanted to draw your attention to this adage: if you're asking what scores you need to qualify for professional school, you're already going about it the wrong way. Remember that I am a big believer that becoming an amazing person is more important than any of the metrics or the activities that you pursue on your way to medical school or any other professional school for that matter. And again, we measure amazingness at some point using these 5 metrics: academics, leadership, service, research, and clinical exposure. And in this video, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what at least I look for as an admissions committee member in each of these 5 areas. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on each one. I think some of the things that you see here are going to be things that you've heard about before, and some of the things I think are going to surprise you. So let's talk about academics first. So we know about GPA. I think that goes without saying. And we know about the standardized tests. So MCAT for medical school, the DAT for dental school, GRE for graduate schools in general, including PA school, and the LSAT for law school. Again, I'm going to be focusing more on the medical sciences, so medical, dental, and PA. One of the things to note about academics for GPA and the score on your standardized test is these are just triage measurements. These are just indicators that help admissions committee members decide whether they want to A, read the rest of your application, and B, want to meet you in an interview. Now, one of the things to keep in mind with academics is that the GPA and the standardized test percentage need to reasonably match. So to give you an extreme example, there is no such thing as making up for a poor GPA, or I should say lower GPA, not a poor GPA. There's no such thing as a poor GPA. There's no such thing as making up for a lower GPA with a high standardized test score. That actually raises red flags, at least in my mind. So if someone has a 3.0 GPA, for instance, but they score in the 100th percentile in the MCAT, DAT, or GRE, that tells me that there's something amiss. Now, sometimes in a person's academic record, there are very legitimate reasons why a person would have a lower GPA relative to their standardized test score. But generally speaking, that could also be that the student decided to take courses that were too hard, or they took courses and didn't perform well because of a number of different factors. And all those factors could be personal, those factors could be socioeconomic, there could be lots of things. But the high test score says that, at least on that particular test, and granted, there are lots of factors that go into this, that the person is an excellent thinker, they understood the test really well, they had access to excellent resources to be able to help them do well. There's all sorts of different things. But the mismatch, the statistical mismatch, is it raises red flags, because I would expect someone who performed relatively well in school to perform relatively well on their standardized test. Having said that, a high score in either of these metrics is a good way to get at least an interview. So schools are not going to ignore you if you have a terrible mismatch, but at the same time, they're going to wonder, well, what happened? And hopefully those kinds of explanations come out in the description of the activities on the application. The next is leadership. So for leadership, service, and research, there's pretty much one litmus test. And the first thing you want to do as you're deciding how you're going to become amazing is choose at least one service activity, or in this case, leadership, in which you can make a major scientific contribution or a major contribution to that field. So I'm going to use the same phraseology for those three areas, but the idea here is that choose one that you can really sink your teeth into. At least for the medical school admissions, you need a total of 15 activities split up relatively evenly between leadership, service, research, and clinical work. But one of those activities for each of those four areas needs to be something that you take significant ownership for, something that you can describe how you made a significant impact in your community and how that community made a significant impact on you. Ultimately, for leadership, you need to demonstrate that you are an agent for improvement or change. And talking about your interactions with people is really, really, really important. How you gained in your qualities of empathy and resilience and creativity. Obviously, smaller leadership projects are helpful too. You're going to need to round out your application somehow, and this shows how you have engagement in your community. Try not to strafe different types of leadership activities. In other words, do this, then this, and this. Think of something that you're really interested in and pursue that theme throughout the things that you do. So maybe you are a polyglot, and so you like to work with Spanish-speaking communities, or other Asian language communities, or whatever. And in different ways, you can lead different organizations to help become an agent for change. So service is very similar. Again, choose one service activity in which you can make a major scientific or service contribution. I like to say volunteering at the hospital is not enough. Now, it's not that it's not a noble pursuit, but many people volunteer at the hospital. Now, let's say you're volunteering at the hospital and you notice something in which you can be an agent for change. Now that activity has a totally different feel and a totally different meaning to me as a person on the admissions committee. Now I see how you are extending yourself out of your comfort zone to make a difference in that community. Again, smaller service projects are helpful too, but try to stay within a theme that interests you or a theme in which you are showing that you're going out of your comfort zone. All right, research is very similar again, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on research. So not only should you choose a research activity, at least one. Some people choose to do lots of research. That's perfectly fine. Some people can only do one. That's perfectly fine as well. But again, you want to make a major scientific contribution. And at least for research, the litmus test for the medical school is that you present as a first author at least one research conference abstract at a national or international meeting. Regional meetings are fine as well, but they're not as impactful. You can also publish a scientific paper, but I will say that for at least the undergraduates that are applying for medical school, a scientific paper is a lot of icing on the cake. If you are graduating from a master's program, like a master's degree program in basic sciences, or a post-baccalaureate program, then a scientific paper is almost a must, because the master's program is your opportunity to really dive into research. And so that is an expectation. I should warn people, though, that if you are participating in a post-baccalaureate program, don't forget about activities in service or leadership and leadership. Those need to continue. Otherwise, the application looks like you're just checking off boxes at different times in your life. We are looking for a theme of how you care about people and communities through service, leadership, and research. I also like to say that pipetting is not enough. Many students are looking for quote unquote research experience because they want to apply for medical, dental, or PA school. Well, I hate to say this to you, but the whole point of research is for you to discover how to fail and how to recover from your failures, and to think innovatively, to think experimentally, to understand how to use evidence in your opinions, in your best practices. So pipetting is good. It's helpful. It could be one of your small projects, but it doesn't really show that you've taken ownership of even the hypothesis let alone the experimental design. So try to find a mentor that is willing to work with you in doing a little bit more than just pipetting. So here are some guidelines that I use. For my lab, at least, I have every potential student answer 3 questions. The first is, what is your scientific passion? Now, this is a super, super important question. And I want potential students to be really honest. And my primary reason is students who pursue scientific questions that they're really interested in always do a good job. And I have had a number of students that have faked what their scientific passion is, and it never turns out well. I discover that really, really quickly, and hopefully we can recover from that and try to find a project for the student that really interests them, not something that they just want to have look nice on paper. So based on that first question, I ask potential students for the scientific question that they want to answer. And this is where I lose a lot of students, because the student will say, well, I don't know where to even start. And that's where I'll respond, take your question and go visit Dr. Google, right? Go find out what's already out there, and then find out what's missing, what hasn't been answered yet, and then come back with your scientific question. And then, of course, if I'm having you ask a scientific question, I'm going to ask you to let me know how you would answer that question. And here we're really digging deep. Is a student willing to go into the weeds and try to figure out what experimental design they would need to craft to be able to answer that question? And if after all this, I'm the correct mentor to be able to help my student, answer that scientific question, then I take them on into the lab. Otherwise, I refer them to colleagues who I think will be better mentors for them. At least my mentorship philosophy is that I am really interested in helping a student progress through their academic career. I'm not interested in students who are trying to help me in my academic career. I mean, I appreciate that. That would be wonderful. It would be great to have an army of pipetters, but that is not going to help the student advance in their career. And so it's not a primary interest of mine. Okay, so a rule of thumb, whether we're talking about research, service, or leadership, if you were not involved in this work, would it be able to continue without you or me, the way this is worded? The reason why this is important is because, again, for each of these 3 activities, you can do some good, but is the community having a significant impact on you, and are you having a significant impact on the community? In your application, I am going to want to know, what are the lessons learned from your activities? And it also tells me the trajectory, the academic, the personal, the professional trajectory that you are making through your career. And as a person on an admissions committee, I want to know if you are the right fit for our community. And what's even more important, particularly for the applicant, is whether our community is the right fit for that person. Can we help that person progress in their career? Some common critiques of research descriptions that I have seen in applications. The first is that the person does not know how to formulate a hypothesis statement. This is often the consequence of a candidate not being really involved in the research process. In other words, they're just a pipetter. They can't describe the motivation, the hypothesis, the technique, the results, and the conclusions of the study. I think this goes without saying. If a student is not involved in the crafting of the project, or at least really diving into working with the mentor, they're not going to know any of these. And that just tells me that they either don't care about research, which may be the case, or they just checked it off, and it was just something that they wanted to do to be able to get into med school. I can't emphasize enough how easy it is to see through that in applicants. The superficial understanding of the relevance. This is also very important, particularly for those who are pursuing medical research or medical sciences research. Why is the research relevant to medicine? Why is it relevant to how you want to care for patients? I have had a number of candidates describe non-medical research, which is perfectly fine, but they did an amazing job at describing how that research had anything to do with medical care. And it was just amazing. I just really enjoyed reading those descriptions. And that brings me to this point. So you have to relate not just your medical research experience, but especially if it's non-medical. How is that experience going to relate to your future as a medical care provider? All right, now the fifth thing here is clinical exposure. And of all of the different activities, in my opinion, this is the hardest one to do during an undergraduate career. This is also the reason why I'm a huge proponent of the pseudo gap year or the gap year, which I will define respectively as applying for school at the end of the senior year of undergraduate or 1 year after graduating from the undergraduate years. And the reason why I'm a big proponent of that is because when do you work in the clinic? I mean, if you're really busy as an undergraduate doing service, leadership, and research, when are you going to actually go and work and put your hands, so to speak, on the patient? I should also mention that research is really hard to do once you've graduated. If you don't have enough research experience that is significant during your undergraduate years, you pretty much have to do a master's degree in order to get that experience. But clinical exposure, you can do that anytime. I mean, if you can do it during your undergraduate years, fantastic. But in my opinion, the best year is to do it during a pseudo gap year or a true gap year. So this takes a lot of time. I mean, we're looking for quite a number of hours of clinical exposure. And I like to see about 5 to 10 hours a week, or about 260 to 520 hours a year. Now, if you're really busy with the other areas, 10 hours a week is a lot of time, unless you're able to carve that out into your weekends or in the summers between semesters. Those are good times. But realistically, it's really hard to do clinical exposure while you're doing the other things. I want to emphasize that clinical exposure is not shadowing. Shadowing is an opportunity to explore different disciplines within the medical sciences field, but it does not take the place of clinical exposure. And I have interviewed a number of candidates who looked great on paper, but did not work in a clinic. Now, I am really, really hesitant about accepting a student who wants to become a doctor that has no clinical exposure. I just have a philosophical difference with that. So, and I will say that for PA students, you have to have a lot of clinical exposure, more than 520 hours in a year. It's more in the order of 1,000 hours per year in order to apply to PA school. Interestingly enough, for dental applicants, it's somewhere in between medical and PA. You don't need to have a high number of hours, but you don't have to have nothing either. Okay, so what clinical exposure is typically employment, and here's where doing this after your senior year or during your senior year is helpful, because I mean, you have to pay for lunch, so this is a really good way to be able to pay for lunch and get clinical exposure. Sometimes though, different types or certain types of clinical exposure are really volunteer work. So one of my favorites is hospice work. That's typically a volunteer position. But one of my other favorites, EKG techs, those are typically an employment position. And there's everything in between, like working at a free clinic, that's typically volunteer work. Working as a scribe, that's typically employment. Scribing is a double-edged sword, because some scribe experiences you're literally just taking notes and have no interaction with the patient. Some scribing experiences, the program or the physicians are able to develop a nice rapport with you, and they can, some of them trust to have their scribes take vitals or do at least intake interviews. And that's a lot more valuable of an experience. It's important that the clinical exposure time be impactful and that you are impacted by that. And so working with the patients directly is super important. I have come across phlebotomy as a clinical exposure, and I find that to be a really, really weak clinical exposure. It's not because phlebotomy is bad in and of itself. It's just that there's really not much time in which you can interact with the patients other than taking their blood. And I'm not saying that phlebotomists aren't helpful. I just don't think it's as strong as, say, hospice work or abuse hotline work. Speaking of which, in this environment, in the pandemic environment, it's really, really hard to get clinical exposure jobs simply because hospital systems are trying to minimize the amount of people that are walking in and out of the hospital. So hotlines or internet text services, suicide prevention type services, those are very abundant and very much needed and very impactful. And the way that applicants talk about those experiences is life-changing, not just for them, but for me. I love hearing those stories. So this all goes back to this question. So you want to go to professional school. Well, you've got to have the experiences to be able to convince me that this is really what you want to do. Also, when you're answering questions in your interview, I'm going to want to know, what did you learn from all of your experiences? And if you don't have adequate experiences, it's going to be really hard to convince me that you are a right fit for the school, or that medicine's even a right fit for you. Or, if not medicine, dental school, PA school, those kinds of experiences. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to present for today. I hope that you found that helpful. Certainly leave comments in the chat, or if you've got questions, down below, please leave those there. And we'll see you next time. It's been great to be with you again. Take care.